Euzu billahi mineşşeytanirracim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi şrah li sadri ve yessir li emri ve hlul ukdeten min lisani yefkahu kavli. Selamun aleyküm ve rahmetullahi ve berekatuh. Inshallah we will start our discussion on the purpose of Quran, how to read scriptures in general. I guess this is the fourth week. Inshallah Yusuf will moderate today, but he's running away from his duties by serving tea, inshallah, in a few minutes. So let's start. Who wants to remind us what we discussed last week in general? Who has the microphone?
First we discussed the story of Yunus alayhi salam. And we looked at each of the characters in that story, and we understood how each of the characters and the events, the set pieces, are actually all can be read within our own lives, and how
Can be or
should be primarily read
thank you.
as this being our story, not a historical account. So we should look at all those details and be thinking like, what does this reveal about myself? So even when we see like if somebody's supposed to be like the antagonist, we don't look at that person and say, right, that is this evil entity or this evil individual in my life. We see, what are these characteristics show me within myself, and what do they like what is the result of these kind of characteristics? Like, what does it bring forth? What am I supposed to learn from seeing the reality of that characteristic, or that personality type? And what is like the Quran trying to teach me about that personality type within myself, or that characteristic within myself, and how it is something that I need to steer away from? Or when I'm seeing how Yunus alayhi salam, when a prophet responds to a difficulty, how can I look at that and think within myself, this is like the proper way, this is the example that I need to follow, and this is what Allah is trying to teach me. So looking at the stories as things that we can learn about ourselves and that we can read into our own lives.
Alhamdulillah. It seems the food was good. We have a hidden gem. MashaAllah. So he raised the bar so high for gentlemen. So ladies should, somehow try to catch it. Anyone else? Oh, so you were raising your hand.
Assalamu alaikum. I think CL captured like the main points. But I guess like my main takeaway from last time was just like the Quran is not like a storybook. So it's like the like stories of the prophets that are there, they're not just like a story I read to get some like moral lesson out of and then ignore all like the details of like in Prophet Yunus alayhi salam's case, like the fish, the people of the town, the people on the boat, like they all represent something in my life. They're not just like side characters who are just there to like move the plot forward. So I should be paying attention to them like more as like see, I was saying like aspects in my life that I can also relate to, and they're not just there. Like the fish, for example, isn't there just there as just like a wow factor, like whoa, he was swallowed by a big fish, and like it was just there to make it to show how like the creator got him out of this impossible situation. But like I should be able to see, it shouldn't be something like, oh, that's never going to happen. Like the fish isn't ever going to happen in my life. But rather there is something like it that I can relate to. And I think the text that we looked at went into sort of like the representations of what each like level of darkness that was in that story, what that represented in our lives in general. So that's what I remember.
Jazakallah khairan. So the one thing you mentioned, the one way of reading it as just as a wow factor, you said. I think this is one of the least useful ways to read any narration, the scripture or so on, which is probably the most common one, especially when it comes to narrations about the Prophet ﷺ, his companions and so on. The way we usually listen to them is just to get, excited. Wow, Imam Ali did this. Wow, Hamza did that, and so on. Just to get excited as if we are watching movies, and it stays there. At most, we take them as, the standing point when we need courage or when we need to find a pride in ourselves. We say, oh, but there are these great the Muslim people in our history, right? Which becomes almost useless for us. It is Hamza did it. I cannot do it. Like it's one of the superior companions. So we just listen them as stories, like a kid's stories. Not only stories, but the stories for kids. And we do that with Qur'an as well sometimes. Okay, I guess if there are no other comments, we can start with the. Oh, yeah.
So today we were having a conversation before the discussion. So I should maybe ask a few questions just to make sure we are convinced. What I mean by we're convinced is it might happen that whatever is being mentioned in here makes sense, unless you start hearing a question which says, oh, I have never thought about this other aspect of it. Because whatever is being discussed in here, unless we put certain boundaries around it, if it is taken as absolute, might entail some unintended consequences as well. So two things might happen. First is we need to put certain boundaries around things. And the second is, which I would like to start from, for example, we said every detail of this story should be talking about me. Why do I expect this from Qur'an? Like, can I expect this from I don't know, Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter? Because in the story of Harry Potter, it's again using a lot of different metaphors. And if you know Lord of the Rings, a lot of metaphors all over the place, although it's like a fantasy world, something is happening in there. So why shall I not apply the same thing over there? So what is special about Qur'an that I am trying to read it in this way? And is this like, am I justified to read it in this way? Or is it just, wow, it sounds good, it makes sense, sort of a thing? Or I really need to read it like that. I cannot read it otherwise. Like, because I need to have a strong justification to follow what's being suggested in here. Otherwise, it's just one way out of many ways. Anyone, if some people are hearing this sort of an interpretation for the first time, it would be like, oh, this is a good attempt. But in fact, the reality is, and then another more authoritative, maybe sort of an interpretation, which talks about, oh yeah, Yunus alayhi salam he was living in somewhere around Levant, and he escaped from his people. So he stayed in the, because I was listening to some recordings about that, they are giving the exact location of the state, which state it is, also based on some hadith narrations. It's not like they're cooking up the story. They're saying that he was living in at that time. This was the city that he lived in. This was the number of people living in that city. And then he stayed in the belly of the fish for 7 days, 40 days, 7 hours. There are different narrations and whatnot. So he gives all these details. And of course, that person is not cooking it up from his head. There had been many mentioning of these details of the story. So if you happen to listen, scholars, and then Irkan comes and says, well, this is how you should, not only you can, but you should read. It sounds like, well, this is too courageous to say. You're not even having a degree in theology or anything. So where is this coming from? So that sort of a thing, I guess, might need to be questioned a little bit so that we know what we are up to.
I think because, like, I agree with you that, like, there is that question about that literal definition of Quran, but I also feel like when people, like when learned scholars at least, ask people to think of the Quran literally, I don't think they're really referring to, like how many days the Prophet stayed in the belly of, I need to stop saying that, in the belly of the whale. But it's more so from the point of being of, you can't really ignore the first addressee of the Quran, which is the Prophet, right? So in that story, there has to be a message for the Prophet that you can't ignore. So it's coming from that perspective. And more specifically to the story of Prophet Yunus, I was hearing a scholar was talking about how it meant to tell the Prophet that, you can't just migrate based on your own whims. That, the people aren't listening, so I'm going to migrate. You can't do that. You have to wait for Allah's command. You have to be patient. So that is the message that is being taught to the Prophet. And then they say that, Allah taught, the Quran is the Prophet's teaching. And then the Prophet is doing our teaching because he taught the society as a whole. Now we will see in Palestine, even kids are saying, Hasbunallahi wa ni'mal wakil. And have they all read the Quran? Maybe not, but they are getting that teaching from their parents, who got it from their parents. So it's being carried forth from the Prophet. So then, is there really a need for the Quran that remains still? What am I trying to get out of it? What is it going to do? Isn't it already doing the guiding in the sense that it came to the Prophet and then Prophet came to us? So that's being the question there.
So, okay. We studied that.
Been off. Okay. Sorry, the mic was turned off. So I'll just repeat what I was saying. So in relation to the first part of Yusuf's question, also to Dua's question, and maybe relating to a bit of what we talked about on Tuesday, I think it's important to think of the Quran in this way because it is like the speech of the creator who created me and knows me in and out completely. So there should be a message in how certain stories are conveyed, or there should be messages within the ayat that I read that maybe contain something that I need to hear at a certain point in my life. So we were talking about how the revelation has been sent down in stages. So at certain points in my life, there are probably certain ayat that are more relevant to me. And also thinking about how the Quran is maybe taught in down the line from the prophets alayhi salam. We also, I think what I remember from sort of what we discussed on Tuesday as well that stuck with me was that the speech of the prophets or mankind is limited. So even what we learn from our parents, who learned again from their parents all the way back, will always contain some limitations. And so we need sort of that speech from the creator, from the original source, to truly understand sort of or to truly get the message, is sort of what I kind of understood. Thank you.
So the reason I wanted to highlight this is Zara is also here. Apparently, after the discussion, some question arose, which is about the boundaries of interpretation as well. So how far can I go with those interpretations? Given that Prophet interpreted Quran with his life in a certain context in this Arabian Peninsula 14 centuries ago. So definitely Prophet was the first addressee of the Quran, and he interpreted the Quran in the best way within those conditions. And today, how am I going to interpret the Quran and somewhat be confident that I'm not making things up out of my own head and just I'm trying to justify whatever I would like to live. Maybe I'm going to buy a house, buy a car, and my money is not enough, and now I need to get some interest, but I heard that interest is not good. Then I start saying that, well, what's your definition of interest? Actually, from this verse, this could be understood in that way too. How far you can go, stretch it as much as you want, right? So what could be or would be then the boundaries of interpretation? Because I don't want to write up a new Quran, sort of, which is going to make everything sort of okay. I guess this is a very legitimate concern. And this is coupled with also the first question that this were why we are trying to interpret it in this way. And yes, as Zareen was saying, so what is my expectation from Quran is an important thing here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to make a 10 minutes short lecture. So something that I benefited a lot listening to Dr. Ali about this one. So it really changed my perspective overall when I look at Quran. It's a little bit technical, but I think it might help. So also it's going to help with Dua's last point. When we say Quran, historically there had been a fight and bloodshed about the topic of whether Quran is created or not. I don't know if you heard about that. Is Quran created or not? It had been a big thing. And so Sultan back in the day was bringing up a verse and saying that this is what God says. And then if you come against it, he was just chopping off your head. Practically what was happening was he was presenting his own interpretation as speech of God. So what is speech of God? What is my interpretation of speech of God? So the two things are separate now. This is, if you heard about Ahmed ibn Hanbal's famous stand against that Sultan's saying that, no, Quran is not created. So what you are presenting is your interpretation. So you are making God speak on behalf of yourself, if you like. So this is why the topic is an important topic and applies to us too. So when they said Quran is not created, what is meant by this is, as far as I understand, what is meant by this is, you look at the existence, you look at the universe, and you see that an apple tree, which is a created being, or a flower, a beautiful flower, or a kitten, it's a created thing, but your creator is speaking to you through that creation. So apple tree is created, flower is created, sunrise is created. All these are created. Your understanding of what that sunrise means, what that flower means, what this baby means is also created. And something created means it's limited, right? It starts here, it ends here. Its color is red, its color is blue. It's not unlimited. But when you say the creator, though, in himself is absolute, then we cannot describe, limit, creator in any shape or form. So Quran is speech of God. In this sense, Quran is uncreated. It is unshaped, undefined. But when it becomes part of my reality, written on a paper like this, spoken out as a word, you memorize it and it's written in your head. These are all created because they are limited. So if I say, look, it's written over there. God says, and then I give you a translation. That translation is not what God says. That translation is what I understood from speech of Creator. And it binds me. Okay, so this is an important distinction to make. Speech of God versus what I understand from speech of God. What I understand from speech of God is created. Therefore, it's bound to have possibly issues. Then the question becomes, how am I going to understand Quran properly then? Because there must be a way that within certain limits, it makes sense. We can say that, yes, this could be one of the purposes, one of the intentions of this verse. Because it's, by definition, speech of God. Infinitely many meanings in there. And even in Quran, Creator mentions, if the seas were to be ink and the trees were to be pen, it wouldn't suffice writing the word of my Creator. So, am I losing you after iftar, or still you're with me? Good. Then the question becomes, what is the territory in which interpretation is proper and what is beyond what is improper? And a few things as we were discussing today. First, Quran is written, revealed in a certain language. So the Arabic language's limitations are there. You cannot go beyond those rules of that language, in the sense that, I mean, there's also poetic use of language. It's also within part of the language. But I cannot say that, oh, in Turkish we use it like this, although apply some Turkish rule into Arabic grammar and try to take something out of it. One would say, come on, this is like, it's in a certain framework. Don't go beyond that. So this needs to be there. Number two, purpose of Quran. This is what we have been discussing for the past 2-3 weeks. What is the purpose of Quran? And the purpose of Quran is really defined based on who you are, who is the speaker, like how much you know yourself, first of all, how much you know about your Creator, because he is the speaker in here, and what's the purpose of that speech? And what is the context of that speech? Do you take it just for the historical context, or are you the context of that revelation? These 4 items, speaker, addressee, purpose of speech, and the context of speech, is also going to define what could be expected from Quran and what not to be expected from Quran. So this is the second thing. The first one was language. The second one is this, the purpose of Quran, maqasid al-Quraniyya. A third one is, as Dua was also highlighting then, Prophet interpreted Quran with his life in a certain time frame. That is a created interpretation. Keep that in mind. That is not the whole interpretation of Quran. Prophet's life is not the whole interpretation of Quran. Because Prophet, as a human, lived within humans in a certain time frame. The problems, the issues that they had in that time, then how am I going to benefit from Prophet's interpretation? Because Dua's question was, since I have Prophet's interpretation, through his life over centuries, then that should be sufficient. I don't need the text anymore. Because if I take this as the interpretation of Quran, Prophet's interpretation is very valuable to me because it teaches how to interpret Quran in a certain circumstances. Your immigration today is going to be different. For them, it was a very physical immigration from Mecca to Medina. Nobody is putting a gun to your head. Does that mean that immigration or verses related to immigration is irrelevant to you? Or in your life, there's another type of immigration that you need to go from one layer to another, maybe not necessarily physical. So the way Prophet interpreted it in his life, then I will look at in my life. So I am trying to learn the pattern, how to interpret from Prophet. This is why it is valuable to me. And in my setup, I'm going to interpret it as such. This was number 3, okay? First one was language. Second one was purpose of Quran. The third one was, how do I benefit from Prophet's interpretation? And now one final thing, fourth is, your understanding is going to be your understanding. So this is why in a proper way, if I were to talk about it and I say, this is what God says in Quran, a more honest way of saying this would be, there's such a verse in the Quran, and what I understand from this is as follows. Because I'm not trying to impose my understanding on you as speech of God. It's my understanding of it. Probably it's right, if as much as it fits in those categories, but still, I am giving this disclaimer saying that this is my understanding. It's not what God is telling you. This is what I understood from speech of Creator. This is why, going back to where this Quran created, not created thing started. So when Muawiyah's army was losing the battle, about to lose the battle, they put pages of Mus'haf to their spears. And then the believers said, oh, out of our respect to Quran, they stopped fight. But what's the trickery here? That's Mus'haf, it's not Quran. It's a page with ink on it. This is not speech of God. It's written. So I do show my respect to definitely speech of God. But something written over there, it's a paper. The person who is putting it before his spear and making it as either like a flag or saying that if you hit this paper, you are going to be attacking Quran or speech of God. No, I'm not. Instead, just opposite. You are using or you're tricking me with saying that if you attack me, you're attacking Quran. If you attack me, you're attacking the Creator. So this was the issue with Quran created versus not created. So let me finish one last point. So all this being said, your understanding of Quran is going to be bound to you. So how do I know if it is true or not? Because at the end of the day, even if you study Quran for years and years, even the best of the shuyukh, it's their understanding. But me, no education, I am also studying Quran, my understanding. Definitely there's going to be a difference of quality. The little I put effort in the Arabic language, the Maqasid al-Quraniyya, Prophet's life, how he interpreted, if I put very little, that much would be trustworthiness of my understanding. If I put more effort, it would be a little more trustworthy. But the baseline is, whatever I understand at the end of the day, I should still have the sense of saying, there's this dua, Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittiba'ahu wa arina al-batila batilan warzuqna ijtinabahu. What does this dua mean? It says, oh Allah, make us see right as right and sustain us by following it, and make us see wrong as wrong and sustain us by avoiding it. This is the stand of an abd. At the end of the day, what you are saying is, oh Allah, yes, I am putting my effort to find the truth, but I am incapable. You guide me. I know I can see right as wrong, wrong as right. I don't trust myself. You are Hadi. You are the one that gives guidance. Still, I am not claiming that what I understood is the truth. I am very convinced, but I might be wrong. So being in that state of an abdness is also necessary. So even after those 3 stages, which you can put effort to, the 4th one still says, don't claim that what you found is the truth. You can say that I pray that this is one of the meanings out of many, infinitely many meanings of this verse. It makes perfect sense. This is a very strong meaning. Even I can tell you that it's a very strong meaning. We can have a conversation, and I might be insisting in that because I'm convinced about it. But when it comes to, like, I'm not going to be arrogant about it, though. I would say that Allahu A'lam, then after all these comes Allahu A'lam, meaning may Allah guide me to the right path. And this is why in Surah Al-Fatiha, we will keep saying, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. So this is a little uncomfortable if you are hearing this type of a thing for the first time, because generally when it comes to religion, we would like to say, how many rak'ah is Fajr? 2? 2. Okay, I'm doing 2. No more, no less. Like, we would like to have those clear-cut answers, right? And now comes to the interpretation of Quran, and then this, if you like, a little vagueness comes into the picture, and it's discomforting, because I would like to have a very clear answer. I get it. So, and then I say, is this what it is? So responsibility is on you, Atik. If it's wrong, in the afterlife, I will point my finger to Atik, and I will say, oh Allah, don't burn me, burn him, and then I'm good. This is how our brain is generally working. But now that we are discussing how to understand the surah and getting into apparently a different territory, such worries might come up. So this is why it's a good thing to discuss this. It took more than 10 minutes, I believe.
You are moderator.
Okay, sorry about
You
that.
want to speak more? Speak.
Okay. Would you like to talk?
I think you address like yes, no. Yeah, so I think your last point sort of, address, what I was gonna mention. So I don't have much to say, but so when it comes to the interpretation of the Quran, I mean, yeah, you said everything, but I strongly believe, like some scholars, they said, how when we don't understand an ayah of Al Quran, we are sort of there's different of opinion about what the meaning of this ayah should be. Then the question will be that how does the prophet interpret this ayah? He was the one that Allah revealed the Quran to. He understood it better than than any other person in this ummah. So how does prophet interpret the Quran? How does the Sahaba, like the Prophet prayed for Ibn Abbas, that in this ummah Allah should make him like understand the Quran more than any other person. So like how does Sahaba that live with him understood the Quran, right? So and I think that even this, like the prophet, his companion, maybe the generation that came after them, how did they interpret the Quran? I think using their thought process to guide the way we also interpret the Quran is going to it's going to really be very helpful, because that's one of the reasons why people try to read this, this tafsir of people that have come before us, what they understand, so that we don't interpret the Quran totally out of the scope of what Allah really meant by those things he revealed. But that was a really good submission by you. Thank you.
So, any comments, any questions?
Just because like you did talk about how there have to be certain boundaries when it comes to interpreting the Quran, which I agree with definitely. When we're talking about a worldview where the Quran is open to interpretation, you do need bounds, because we see what happens when things go out of those bounds. But then my question is, like, what are the prerequisites then? Or are there any prerequisites then to reading the Quran? Because you talked about boundaries, right? But like, you're a rational person and you're assuming everyone here is a rational person. We're coming from a certain worldview of, oh, don't kill people and blah, 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 whatever. But someone who's like the child of a Taliban, for example, right? They're coming from a different worldview. How do they define the boundaries? What are the prerequisites to opening the Quran? Like, okay, you know, I understood Deen from this source, and now I know what the boundaries are, what limitations are to reading the Quran. So now I can open it and I will understand what it's saying. Are there any prerequisites? Like, how do you do that? But also, the Quran says that, you know, this Quran is in clear Arabic. But then I'm looking at interpretations of the Quran, which have been done by people who do speak Arabic, but some of them are just, you know, not agreeing with each other. I'm not even going to say they're wrong or whatever. They're not agreeing with each other. And these are people who are even speaking Arabic themselves. Someone is translating, you know, a word in some way, taking it in some way, another is taking it in another way. So then if the Quran is relevant to everyone, right? And the Quran is saying this is the Quran in a clear Arabic language. I'm not even going to talk about myself. I don't know the Arabic language, but people who do know the language, how is it not clear to them? How are there being like differences then?
And the question is, assuming clear means just one meaning though, right? Do we agree with that? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
A question, maybe technical question, I don't know. But like, why? Because I know that there are other schools of thought that still believe that the Quran is created. So do we have to believe that the Quran is eternal and able to to interpret it the same way as you're saying? Like, I didn't understand the correlation between believing that the Quran is eternal, like because it's a speech of God, and the way we should interpret it.
So it being created means it is limited. This is the issue with that. Like once
It has one meaning, or at least let's say 5 meanings, or maybe 7 meanings. But we're talking about 3 billion people, applying to 3 billion people, and so on. Oh, the microphone.
Yeah. So the createdness is important because of that reason, or non-createdness. Like, same thing applies with belief in prophethood as well. Let me go one step back. When we say belief in prophethood, what do we mean by that? Do we mean that this man over there with flesh and bones, this is the prophet? Is this what belief in prophethood means? Or belief in prophethood rather could mean the one who created me, I would expect him to provide me guidance through human examples too. So believing in that man being a prophet is part of that, but not the entirety of it. Because none of us in here really have seen the prophet in his flesh and bones. That's why belief in prophethood is beyond just pointing finger to someone. Likewise, belief in scripture does not simply mean this text written over there is speech of God, but it is rather the one who created me in a way that I can communicate using the language, who is at the same time speaking through creation, as if with a sign language. I would expect him to talk to me in a language that I can understand. This is belief in speech, because Creator speaks. So this is one of the attributes of the Creator, mutakallim. So he speaks, he must speak. This is what belief in scripture means. So Qur'an, in this case, being the speech of the Creator, it's absolute. There are some wrinkles in there, also in my understanding, but what scholars used to say, for example, Quran is summarized in Fatiha, Fatiha is summarized in Bismillah, Bismillah is summarized in the dot of that B. Sounds very much of an exaggeration, isn't it? Quran is summarized in Fatiha, Fatiha is summarized in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is summarized in the dot of that B, like in the first letter. The whole Quran is pretty much summarized in a single letter, they say, which sounds very much of an exaggeration. But within the purposes of Quran, I mean, the ones who said it in a way, as they refer back to Quran being the absolute eternal speech of the Creator, which is unshaped, at the end of the day, what you are doing is, you are as if tapping, by your understanding, you are tapping into an absolute source. The source is absolute. If it was 1 verse, 100 verse, 1,000 verse, that's not the point. The point is what you are receiving from is an absolute source. So no matter what, whatever we take to our hands as Quran is going to be from Quran, but limited with my understanding, limited within my capacity. So this is why whatever you touch your hand upon or your mind upon, it's created, yes. But in itself, speech of Creator must be absolute because we are talking about the Creator. It's absolute. And this conclusion actually allows me to say that, well, this is a live text. It's not a dead text. If it was a created dead text, it would be have written 14 centuries ago and whatnot. It's there. But as I take it, speech of my Creator today, I don't take this as a text written 14 centuries ago. I am reading this text as it is being spoken to me right now. It is, because the speaker is alive, the Creator is alive. I mean, he is al-Hayy, and he is al-Mutakallim. As much as al-Hayy is absolute, al-Mutakallim is also absolute. And I am now listening from him. Whatever touches me is a created meaning. But I know that the source is absolute. If the source was limited, I wouldn't be able to interpret it as much. This is why initially the question I asked, what was the question? I said, can't we apply the same sort of interpretation to any story? Lord of the Rings, let's say. Can't I apply the same attitude of, let's try to interpret it to every single detail as if Tolkien knew me, 2024, Philadelphia, a guy in this room is going to read my story. Can I do that to Tolkien's text? No, I can't. Because it's a text written by a certain limited human being in a certain limited setup. That text is created, for sure. It's a limited text. Quran is not a limited text in the sense that كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه. I am reading this verse today. I might have read it 10 days ago, but 10 days ago, Yusuf was a different person. The environment that I was living in, the circumstances, I was in Turkey 10 days ago, right? Now I'm in a totally different environment. I am a different person today because there's a cute boy in front of me and whatnot. So my situation is changing, and the speaker is all aware of my situation. Within that situation, I will reinterpret the verse. I can do that as long as the speech is uncreated. I can, because I am tapping into an absolute source. I can expect this. If the speech was created, I wouldn't be able to expect this from the speech. This is why that debate was an important debate. Like, people really shed blood in the past because of this. How did they use it in the past? Kings said that my understanding is God's understanding, or what God meant, and imposed their agenda on people by using God's authority. This was the political use of it. This was very ugly political use of this attitude. But now I'm going to read it in a way that, like, my life is changing, constantly changing, and I am in need of a support from my Creator, who knows me better than myself. So this is why that is so relevant, that apparently technical detail, but very relevant to us. Since Quran is as such then we can read those stories not as stories, but as it is like my story. And the motivation for that is, if you go into, let's say, a very wise man's visit, let's say you're struggling and whatnot, and there's a very famous sheikh, and they say that, oh, the sheikh is, once you get into the room, he just makes an x-ray to you as if with the eyes, understand what's going on in you, what trouble you're going on in your life, and then start saying a few words. Let's assume such a person exists. Okay, it sounds very much science fiction like, but
They don't exist.
we have a lot of Turkish soap opera like this. But yeah, I mean, in Sufi tradition, there are stories like that. Anyways, but let's assume you have this very wise sheikh. And sheikh, after taking your x-ray, starts talking a few words and really hitting the chore marks very properly. And then you say, wow, like he said this word, he said this word, he said this word. You can take it as, oh, he's just talking about some story somewhere else. You can read it as such. But you can also read it as, no, this guy is really giving apparently a story about somebody else, but actually he was talking about me, every single detail he gave. No such person exists, or, I mean, no matter what that person says, it's not going to be 100% applicable. I mean, there are wise people out there, but you wouldn't be able to say that, well, 100%, it's just 30%. Take your share, leave the rest away. But my creator is speaking. All wise is speaking. This is why I could, and actually I should, expect Qur'an to, in all details, this is not the story of a third person. It's my story first and foremost. But I shouldn't add another anecdote here, because this is why we are studying this text. The question was, Sister Sarah was asking, Quran is talking about the creation story of Adam. And it says, I created Adam from clay. So, and then this is apparently contradicting the theory of evolution and whatnot. So what do I do with this, right? Fast forward, we'll get to there. But last week, we were studying Yunus alayhi salam's story, and he was thrown into sea, swallowed by a fish. When Nursi was studying it last week, he didn't go into the details of the story. He gave a very brief summary, and he started focusing on how it applies to me. He didn't talk about fish, because if we take it again literally, we would ask the question, like, you're going to stay in the belly of a fish and you're not going to die? Like, you will suffocate, first of all. If not, you're going to get digested in no time and whatnot, right? So, I mean, it is as hard of a sell as the other one. So this is why Nursi is not even getting in there. But there's a big comma over there. Prophets lived real lives. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ lived a real life too. Ibrahim ﷺ thrown into fire and walked out of fire alive. Shall I take this metaphorically? Sure, take it metaphorically for your life. But in fact, such a thing has happened or not? I cannot prove that, first of all. But I don't see any reason why this could not have happened at all either. And actually, I would say such things must have happened in prophets' lives, because I do see miracles in prophets' life, and it's a necessary thing. Prophets having miracles is a necessary thing. But if I take the miracle side of the story as the story itself, the most important part of the story, as Birkan was saying, it gets distant from me. It's becoming less meaningful to me, because I'm not going to show that miracle. Like, if somebody is going to throw you into fire, what would you say? Yeah, throw me, I'm going to walk into the fire. You won't say that. So it doesn't apply to you in that sense of the story. But there is no reason I would say that, oh, that aspect could never have happened. No, it's totally fine. That literal meaning is also true. But it's not the number one priority. This is what I'm trying to say. So all the discussion that's going on in here is pointing to a very relevant, if not the most relevant aspect of that story for us. But as Rasulullah says, Quran has multiple meanings. It has the major meanings. It has branches of branches. So Rasulullah mentions that Quran, every verse has multiple meanings. So let's be open to that. But in this discussion, what we are trying to do is attracting our attention to what is more relevant to us. Because when stories of prophets mentioned, it's either being mentioned, as Birkan was mentioning at the beginning of today's discussion, it's either being mentioned as some story, just like a story, and you take your share out of it, or it's being taken as literally something has happened, and the debate is starting to happen about, oh, was it a gourd tree? Was it a banana tree, or whatever sort of a tree? Like, this is not the point. So let's focus our attention to something that's more relevant. But this discussion should not be understood. I mean, the reason that I'm giving this lengthy intro is, in our discussions, we are focusing on some parts of it. This doesn't mean that this is the only part of it. This is the most relevant part of it. And we put emphasis over there because some other part was being overly emphasized unnecessarily. To counter that, sometimes we emphasize this other aspect. And this is really should be emphasized. And we will keep doing this moving forward. But this should not mean that, oh, Ibrahim alayhi salam was actually, he was never thrown into fire. That would mean, and then we start giving some metaphorical interpretation. This would be an injustice. No. He physically, yes, he must have been thrown into fire or some sort of a miracle showed in his life. And this goes back to, we didn't discuss it here, but we were discussing it at Drexel today. Why is miracles necessary in Prophet's life? But miracles are necessary, and we already know that every creation is sort of a miracle also because of all our causality discussion and whatnot. So nothing is really out of our understanding in there. But all these being said, still, for today, we are out of time. But next week, again, we will then study Ayyub alayhi salam's story, where he is very sick, he has many wounds, and then he makes a supplication, and his wounds are being cleared. When discussing this, we will not talk about, well, was he really sick? Or what sort of a sickness was it? Because in the supplication, Ayyub alayhi salam will say that the wounds started approaching my heart and my tongue. What sort of a worm was it? Was it really digging a hole in his body and started to eat his heart really? What sort of a flesh-eating bacteria was that? We are not getting into that. Or we will not say that, well, was it really a sickness or was he going through some psychological depression? We're not going to get to that. The point would be, let's read it. However it happened for him, let's come back to me, because the relevant part is this story speaks to me. What are my wounds? And the author will start talking about my wounds. He will do the same thing. He'll give us a very brief summary of the story. And Quran gives very brief summary of those stories and attracts our attention to how does it apply to you. So this is the framework, more or less. If you have any questions, please, let's take it. We have 2 more minutes.
Is every story applicable at the same time?
Same time too?
Yeah. So depending on which story you read, you can apply all of them in a certain way, certain interpretation.
Okay. I mean, that's a practical question. And to me, practically, no, practically. Because when you're happy, you're in a different mood. When you're sad, you're in a different mood. And the major messages of Quran, yes, I am in need of major messages of Quran for the whole time. This is why Quran is repeating, because you cannot read the whole Quran all at once. But sometimes when you are sad, you're going to read a different story. When you are happy, you're going to read a different story. So when you're having issues with your parents, you're going to read a different story. When you're having issues with your children, you're going to read a different story. But when you are having issues with your parents, yet when you read something about a story about the children, still you're going to have messages in there too. So I think this is guidance. So, and there's practicality in there. So there's no point of, to me at least, discussing about theoretically, am I equidistant to all those at the same time? Well, at the end of the day, this is guidance that you are seeking for in your practical life. So I think it makes more sense to practically speak, how do I benefit from this message? And practically speaking, I am in need of certain verses sometimes and certain other verses in some other times. And there was 2 questions from Zar, which should be for next week. Any other question?
We have 2 minutes.
We have 2 minutes. Okay, Zara says, if Quran is at the mercy of my understanding, my interpretation then, okay, let me read it. If Quran is at the mercy of my understanding, my interpretation, then how is Quran Mizan? How it is Furqan? How is it distinguishing right from wrong? Is that not a contradiction? How is it the judge in truth between the people concerning that in which they differed? How will it guide me if I can't definitively choose between 2 perfectly contradictory interpretations? Okay. Next week? Okay. Next week, people say. So you'll need to copy this somewhere, Zahar. And there's another question from Zahar. Why are we assuming it is my story? Why are we not assuming this is a story with a message perfectly for me? Zahar, is this a question? So the second one is, if it is a message perfectly for you, then that means it's your story. But if it's a perfect message for you, then that means it's your story. If there's imperfection in there, then it's a different story. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, so let's conclude here, inshallah. And next week we can continue with Zara's first question, and inshallah we can study the text. And I apologize for not reading the text from Brother Birkan especially, because it was generally me who would insist reading the text, and today I didn't read the text. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وآخر دعواهم من الحمد لله رب العالمين الفاتحة.